So yeah, this is our 7th gathering, and we're just really glad that you're here. We are better because you're here and a part of our time. This is sponsored by the coaching ministry of the ELCA and the church-wide offices Here to Serve initiative. I am Jill Beverlin, the coordinator of coaching for the ELCA. It's important for you to know that the intent of these meetings is to provide a safe and brave space for faith leaders to gather. Our format is to open with reflections from a guest speaker and then break into small groups in order to engage in sharing on the topic of the day. It's also important to note that we don't come to these meetings believing that we will leave with all of the answers. Rather, this is meant to be a place where we can name our truth, the truth of our feelings, our situation, and our hope in this time of fear and chaos. And in doing so, figure out our next most faithful step. Many of us have said, we haven't done anything like this before. In our lifetime, it's true, we have not faced a pandemic of this magnitude or severity. But over the course of human history, the world has encountered life-threatening disease and other challenges of mass proportion. And we can learn from this. History enshrines collective experience and is vital to the development of our communal and individual sense of identity. History connects the past with the present. History matters because it helps us understand why we are the way we are and begins to name what we value and how that affects our ability to move forward. Romans 15:4 states, "For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope." It is with this that I introduce our guest speaker today, the Reverend Dr. Martin Lohrmann, Associate Professor of Lutheran Confessions and Heritage at Wartburg Theological Seminary. Among other works, he is the author of the Book of Harmony, Spirit and Service in the Lutheran Confessions, and the forthcoming resource, Stories from Global Lutheranism, a historical introduction. Dr. Lohrmann will share with us some insights about how Lutherans around the world and across history have put their faith into action in times of crisis and challenge. And now, Martin.
Hi, thank you so much, Jill, and thank you all for being here. It's a wonderful thing to see folks coming together, and I'm really excited for this time with you. So I have the presentation coming up. All right, you see it? Thumbs up, Jill? All right, cool. Step one. I have sent Jill an outline, and so she might be able to share it with you somehow. So she has that, so you can have it. You don't have to remember everything, basically, is the purpose of the outline. My talk today is called Resilient Lutherans, Insights from Church History. And I have images throughout. These are either my personal photos or public domain. So just to say that. This is a book cover. My Stories from Global Lutheranism will be coming out in a little bit. And a lot of these are things I've learned over time about how Lutherans have adapted to their contexts around the world over the centuries. And a key theme is that Lutherans have rich examples of how to put faith into action in times of adversity. So it can feel scary, it can feel uncertain in these times, and it turns out we're not alone in these times. The communion of saints is a rich resource. So in this presentation, I have 5 topics, really, 5 sources of resilience that Lutherans can share with each other from the global church. So global stories of resilience through personal support, through art, through pastoral imagination and adaptive leadership, through social services and peace building. People being courageous in their time and place to work for the good of their neighbors. So the picture here is Katie Luther, Martin Luther's wife, Katharina von Bora. This is the tablet covering her grave. It's in the city church in Torgau, and I'll talk about Torgau a little bit. But Lutherans have each other as resources. One letter, Katie is described as Martin Luther's partner in calamities. And this was already earlier in their life together. They experienced the loss of 2 children. They experienced the ups and downs of financial markets and hardships. They were mutual supports for each other. Towards the end of his life, when Luther is traveling and then he dies on that trip, Katie was worried about him. And Luther writes, in one of his basically daily letters back to her, pray and let God worry, to spend time in Scripture, spend time in the resources of the faith, and give our concerns to God. So they were that for each other. And not every close relationship works out that well all the time, but we do have these resources in each other, the people around us that God has given us to know and to love. Part of the calamities included, like I said, the loss of some children and many hardships. Part of the reason why Luther in 1527 writes this thing that the ELCA has found some good quotations from, whether pastors should flee in a time of plague. That's 1527. Part of the reason why Martin Luther stays in town is Katie was pregnant at that time. So they have personal things going on. They have social things going on in the midst of outbreak of the plague around them. So a personal dimension there. Martin Luther himself was a refugee in exile. He was banished from really his own land in the Holy Roman Empire and had to take shelter for a year at Wartburg Castle. Katie herself was a refugee after Luther died 2 times. There was a war after Luther died, 1547, and she leaves Wittenberg, and their fields get ravaged, and it really leaves her in poverty. Martin Luther had left her in good shape, but the war really affects her income and family household. And then she dies in 1552 while she's out of town again, fleeing a plague, which is why she's buried in Torgau, because that's where she died during an accident. So these are kind of sad stories, but they're also stories of sympathy, stories that let us know people have been there for each other for a long time. And sometimes that's a close relationship, like a husband and wife, parent-child, sibling relationship. Then there's also friendships. This is Luther's table at his home in Wittenberg. And again, to that outbreak of the plague in 1527, Luther and his friend Pomeranus, John Bugenhagen, stayed in town. Bugenhagen was the head pastor. Bugenhagen's wife was also pregnant. And so here Luther remembers right here at this table, when the rest of you were in Jena, when the university moved because of the plague, Pomeranus sometimes consoled me when I was sad. And these words were a great comfort to me. As a voice from heaven, they struck me in my heart, although I think Pomeranus did not realize at the time what he had said and that it was so well said. So Luther really relied on friendships. And I say this because sometimes we think of the content of what he said, him as a theologian, him and his contextual wisdom, like what the church ought to do here or there. But also he had deep friendships and personal supports. To move more into the 1600s, Lutherans have turned to the arts in times of trial. Philip Nicolai was a survivor of war, of plague, and religious exiles, multiple. He got kicked out of town for being Lutheran. He's the author of O Morning Star, How Fair and Bright, ELW number 308. And as beautiful as this hymn is, and it is my single favorite hymn among many wonderful hymns, it literally embeds grief for a friend who died of the plague into this meditation on Christ. So it's rich poetic language, and his grief is buried there in that hymn. It's embedded, and in this text, praising Christ for life, for goodness, He's remembering his friend, Wilhelm Ernst, Count and Lord of Waldeck. So it's like an acrostic in the 6 verses in German. Each verse begins with a letter commemorating his friend. Another Lutheran poet from the time of the 30 Years' War is Yuri Tranoffski. Got his name there as Tranoffski. He wrote in Czech mostly, and so became an important hymn writer for the Czech, Slovak, and Polish Lutheran churches. And we have a hymn of his in the ELW 608. He was a refugee of the war, had to move around a lot, go into hiding sometimes. And in his hymn, he writes, "Your heart, O God, is grieved, we know, by every evil, every woe. Upon your cross-forsaken Son, our death is laid, and peace is won." So there he has so much imagery through this poem about the grief of humanity, the grief of God for us, and the solidarity of God with us to go through death and hell for us and give us life and peace. And another hymn writer of the 17th century is Anna Sophia von Hesse-Darmstadt. And she has a hymn. This hymn is in the Lutheran hymnal, which was the Missouri Synod hymnal from around the 1940-ish. And here she writes, "Lord, thy words are waters living, where I quench my thirsty need. Lord, thy words are bread life-giving, on thy words my soul doth feed. Lord, thy words shall be my light, through death's veil and dreary night. Yea, they are my sword prevailing, and my cup of joy unfailing." So through death's veil, through dreary night, we turn to the Lord. And we don't just do this intellectually or theologically, we do this with our whole being, which is why art is so wonderful, because art gives us this expression, this language that's even beyond, say, sentences. We break out into poetry and hymn, both out of sadness and out of joy. Moving into the 1700s, 1800s, another resource in times of trial from Lutheran history is adaptive leadership, which often requires pastoral imagination. The leaders in a community, congregation leaders, pastors, deacons, can think, what do we need for this time and place? And so among many wonderful leaders in global Lutheranism in these, say, middle centuries over the last 500 years, one would be Henry Muhlenberg in colonial Pennsylvania. And he comes, and if you think Americans are, loud, and Americans are independent-minded, and Americans don't want to be told what to think, and you can't make anybody do anything, that's how it was 250 years ago in the colonies, before this was the United States. And Henry Muhlenberg has to think, how do you build a church in this kind of setting? And he does it really by emphasizing the goodness of a congregation coming together for a shared experience of word and sacrament and communal enrichment, education of the young, walking together in times of grief. And so Muhlenberg builds what becomes the North American Lutheran Church really on this grassroots level of tending to communities in a really unique time and place. Wilhelm Lua, who's a founder of Wartburg Seminary where I teach, he never came to the U.S., but in the 1840s he got a letter from a pastor on what was then the American frontier, and it said, we need pastors. And so Lua, in kind of Bavaria, northern Bavaria these days, he thinks, what can I do? And so he just starts training young people who might be interested in going and serving in a different continent. He called it an emergency seminary, because he didn't set up his own entire, accredited system, but he said, I'll give people the building blocks, then they'll go and they'll get connected with the churches in North America, and then those churches will put them to work and ordain them and all that. So Lewis set up an emergency seminary. And since I teach at Wartburg, it's become a handy concept for us because it shows that times always change and needs are different. And what is the need for this time? That's a nice legacy to have. Wartburg's over 160 years old, and we still think, what what is the gospel for today, and how do we serve the gospel? How do we serve people with the gospel? John Mittelholzer, pictured here on the left, was a pastor in Guyana. In Guyana, which is in northern South America, Lutherans had been there since the 1700s or so because of colonialism. So it served basically the white colonizers, and it was not an integrated church for a long time. And eventually the colonial system was kind of weakening, and the church is weakening with that system. And John Mittelholzer was a mixed race man, Swiss and Guyanese Creole. And the people look to him and they say, we would like your leadership. And Mittelholzer does a remarkable job then of giving the church to the people, really. Instead of being a church for a few, Mittelholzer shares church with everybody. And so he's a wonderful example of how to empower the local people. Ludwig Nommensen, not pictured, was a missionary to Indonesia. And there's now well over, I think, 4 million Lutherans in Indonesia, in particular on the island of Sumatra. Nommensen was German, but he valued the Batak culture of that part of Indonesia. And so he translated, and also he respected their context, their beliefs, and he thought, how do we share the gospel in this situation? And so Nommensen was really a fine example of what we would call now accompaniment, and also sharing the gospel. You know, this is why Jesus matters for people's lives, and an important figure in Sumatra. And then he, of course, invites the local folks to take positions of leadership, which steadily increased over time in Indonesia. And Onesimus Nasib, pictured here, was somebody freed from captivity, from slavery, by Swedish missionaries in the area of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and given an education. Actually, he went to Sweden and attended seminary and came back and translated the Bible, continued to preach among the people, and now the single largest Lutheran church in the world is the Ethiopian evangelical church, Mekane Yesus, in Ethiopia. And Nasib is a big part of that because he saw the good that the gospel does and then worked to translate it. How do we share this good thing with the people around us? So that takes some imagination, takes adaptive leadership. And we are in those kinds of times. And it's okay to not know what it's going to look like quite yet. Lutherans also have a rich legacy of social service. Theodor Fliedner was a founder of a deaconess house in Germany. This was as industrialism was happening across Europe. And there's a lot of social needs, a lot of poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunity. And so he thinks, how can we see the need around us and then give tools? And so he sees that women have a lot to offer, and he starts a deaconess house, which then starts schools and hospitals and trains nurses, trains teachers that really become powerful leaders in the Lutheran Church and around the world. Elizabeth Fede is one of these deaconesses. She's Norwegian. Her brother was in New York City as a sailor and says, the sailors here need ministry, please come. So she comes. And she helps found a hospital in Brooklyn, which is still there to this day. And then she's also later on answers a call to Minneapolis and starts a hospital there, and then eventually goes back to Norway. But a major figure for the American deaconess movement. She's one who said, I've heard this attributed to other people, but she actually said, you sisters are the Bible that the patients will see today. You know, so that through the social ministry, through the nursing care, through pastoral care, people would get to know God through the service of these sisters. And then one of my favorite folks is Anna Kugler from the Ministerium of Pennsylvania, who was trained up, got some medical training around Philadelphia, and then spent her career in India, starting hospitals, building community resources. And an important person for healthcare in India, an important person for the church in India, a real co-worker with the church there. And Lutherans have been in India for 300 years now, since the early 1700s. But I like to talk about Anna Kugler. And Lutherans have been courageous people of faith who work for peace. Nathan Söderblom was an Archbishop of Sweden who worked for peace in between World War I and World War II. He died in the 30s. Albert Schweitzer was a medical missionary. He was also an incredible scholar, an incredible organist, but he felt the call to go serve as a medical missionary in the Congo region in Africa. Dag Hammarskjöld worked for the United Nations, was a person of faith who knew Söderblom. Norman Borlaug was from Iowa, where I live now, an American Lutheran who's sometimes called the man who saved 1 billion lives because of his vocational work in food technology and making hardier strains of wheat and other grains that would survive in places like Mexico and Pakistan so that people would have better food options. And Lima Bowie, pictured here, see, I was in the very back at the churchwide meeting in 2016 when she spoke. So there she is on the big screen, but worked for peace, organizing women in Liberia to help end the Liberian Civil War. These are people of faith who see the need around them and claim their Christian identity first and then share it in wonderful ways with the people around them. So as my talk comes to an end here, faithful and resilient. Lutherans have looked to each other for mutual support in times of trial. There's been a passionate use of the arts, adaptive, imaginative leadership for new context, social service, and courage to claim and share Christ's love. I like this picture, so we'll end here. Luther, you know, sometimes stuff happens, right? But we have resources and friends in the gospel, even and especially in the hard times. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and God's blessings on your ministries.
Martin, thank you so much for your time and sharing. It's been fun to see the responses in the chat section, and we'll share all of those praises with you in a follow-up email. For those of you that have been asking, Martin has indicated that he has sent me an outline providing all of this information. So some of you were a little panicked. He was saying such great stuff. You didn't want to miss a word. It sounds like he's provided a tool for us to have access to this information. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So Jill, you'll have that outlined in an email.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. Thank you. So if you have given us your email address as a participant in the chat section, we can share that outline with you. Okay, yeah. So with this great information as a backdrop for us, I have created breakout rooms for you to go to. You should have at least one coach in your room. And if for some reason there's not a coach in your room, we're trusting that you maybe even can coach yourselves. This is not a perfect science here, creating these breakout rooms. And but ask yourselves the question, what shines for you from what Dr. Lohrmann has shared? And what about that brings you hope? And from that, what next most faithful step might you take? So we are going to chat for about 30 minutes in your small groups. I will give you a 5-minute warning to come back. You will have to click on the tab to join your room. Okay? So with that, God bless your conversation. And again, thank you, Martin, for your time and sharing your gifts with us today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure.
If you feel led to, what was valuable about this time? And coaches in particular, if you can encapsulate themes that you were hearing without betraying the confidence of those that you were journeying with, we would love to hear that.
I think, Jill, value in being able to gather with people and simply share and know you're not alone in what you're facing. A couple of interesting things. In one location, they've established a hotline for seniors so they could have a place to call and have someone to talk to, as well as to identify any physical needs that needed assistance. Another was very involved in food distribution, in gathering and distributing, working with a local food bank. And I think a sense of hopefulness built on the resilience of our past as people of God and as Lutherans, knowing we've been through this before, we will get through it again together.
Yeah. Amen. And Dr. Martin really set the stage for us leaning into that hopefulness. Yeah.
Jill,
who else would like to share?
Hi, Jill. Carol.
Hi, Carol.
Schultz. It was really a wonderful experience I had 3 pastors to meet with and coach, and we talked about what the concept of resilience means at a time like this to them personally. One was brave enough to share that he has had the time now in this quarantine situation to deal with some personal issues that when he's really busy, he tends to put to the side, which I think is just a really wonderful insight. And another said she recognized that maybe she doesn't always have to be resilient. God's strength is made perfect in weakness, which just underscores what you said about being a safe and brave place. These people are very brave.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you for helping us name and claim that.
And we talked a bit about what's ahead, using Zoom in new ways, having fun with it, having explored now that they know the technology a bit better, what they can do. Like, maybe they can have their trivia night or the fun stuff. Everyone's been so focused on Holy Week and worship, sort of the bread and butter things, and now we can have the dessert. And also then when still the theme is that there needs to be self-care in all of this.
Yes.
And when we're being told we have to stay home and the only thing we can do is maybe go for a walk, but we have allergies and can't go to the gym, it's pretty challenging.
Okay. Thank you for that. One more reflection before I invite Bishop Candia to give us a word of closing and blessing.
I'd be happy to say something, Jill. This is Sue Best from Portland. I'm a deacon, and so it just so happened that the person I was with, we are both breast cancer survivors, and she's just going through treatment, and I went through treatment a dozen years ago. So there's no accidents in life. So it was a really lovely opportunity for us to just talk about that shared experience and from where we find hope and support, kind of like Martin Luther, who always sought his friendship. So I was grateful for that time for us to talk about those things.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for showing the Spirit's hand at work yet again, Sue. Deeply appreciate that. And thank you for offering other themes and reflections in the chat area. We capture those. That information actually is shared all the way up to Bishop Eaton. She wants to know what's on the hearts of the leaders in the ELCA. So thank you for taking the time to share your heart and your thoughts in that way. At this point, I would like to invite Bishop Susan Candia of the Central State Synod to please unmute herself. Bishop Susan is going to invite or share a short reflection of her own about what this time has meant for her and close us in prayer and blessing. So Bishop Susan.
Thank you very much, Jill. So a lot of the thoughts have been going around in my head, particularly during this Easter season, just this continual kind of understanding that the resurrection is not resuscitation. It is not about a dead body coming back to the same life. And whatever's happening, it's not going to be the same. my friends, and it scares me to death in many ways in trying to figure out how to lead people who are already anxious and to say, we're not going to go back to quote unquote normal. The world has changed and we have changed. But then I think, duh, isn't that what resurrection is? I mean, we are resurrected. And what really helps in my own prayer, Walter Brueggemann, many of you have probably have this resource. I love it. It's Ode to Heaven, Rooted in Earth. And he does, when he, his Easter prayers, and I hadn't thought of using it this way, but he simply asks God to Easter us. Ask God to Easter us. And so that is my prayer for this whole church, for this whole world, that God would Easter us in joy, Easter us in strength, Easter us in compassion, Easter us in courage, Easter us in creativity, and Easter us to be the resurrected people you have called and claimed and chosen and empowered us to be. So in my anxious moments, you know, people have asked me, so how are you doing as bishop through these times? And I just kind of take a breath and say, to be honest, I don't really know, but I'm not in charge of the church. Christ is. And so my prayer is, okay, God, keep Eastering us. And that is my blessing for all of us. Easter us in these days and weeks ahead. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you and to participate. I find these extremely helpful. Take care.
Yeah. Thank you, Bishop Susan. Thought I was going to make it without crying again, but nope. Susan made me cry. So thank you again for joining us, friends. We will be here again next Wednesday at 1 o'clock with the Reverend Dr. Robert Smith, who is the director of Briarwood Leadership Center in Dallas, Texas. And we're going to be talking about the concept of societal chaplaincy and what that means for all of us. Really interesting topic, and it's a way for us as church to feel encouraged, empowered, and equipped to love and serve the world in this time in a way that others cannot, because we have the power of the Spirit and what that means for us. So please join us. It just means so much. I'm encouraged knowing that you all are the faces of the Bible that the people in the world will see as you go about your week. So thank you for that. Thank you for everything that you reflect to me personally. God loves you. I love you. Keep doing your good work, and we'll see you next week. Bye, friends. Thank you.